She came back from the dead, and they arrested her for it. 17 days, enemy territory, no resupply, no air support, no word from command. Commander Maya Reynolds carried 14 soldiers out of that hell on nothing but will and nerve. She should have come home to a medal. Instead, Colonel Ethan Caldwell was standing on the runway with military police and a set of charges already typed up and waiting. He stripped her weapon, her badge, her command. But what Caldwell didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 3 days before that runway, someone had hit record. And that recording was about to burn everything down. If stories like this hit different for you, subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The helicopter came in low and fast, the way they always did when the pilots were nervous. Maya felt the deck shudder under her boots as the Black Hawk crossed the perimeter fence at Redstone Naval Operations Base, the running lights cutting pale slashes through pre-dawn fog. She was sitting closest to the door, the way she'd sat for 17 days whenever she slept, which wasn't often and never deeply. Old habit. You stay near the exit when the walls might close on you. She was 34 years old and she felt 60. The bruise along her left ribs had darkened to something between purple and black over the past 4 days. Her shoulder had been field dressed twice. The second time, Corporal Torres had done it in the dark with 2 inches of paracord and a pressure bandage from a dead man's kit, and it held well enough. Her boots had started falling apart somewhere around day 12, and she'd wrapped the left one in electrical tape she'd stripped from a disabled comms relay. She looked like she'd been dragged through 2 counties of bad country. She had. Behind her, across the cramped cabin, sat the men she'd brought back. 14 of them. She'd counted every morning for 17 days, the same ritual, touch each shoulder and count. Sergeant Delaney with his arm in a makeshift sling. PFC Garrett, 19 years old, who hadn't spoken a full sentence since day 9, but whose eyes tracked and focused, which was enough. Specialist Okafor. Tech Sergeant Ramos. Chief Aaron Mitchell, whose right shoulder had taken shrapnel on day 4, and who'd been operating on Motrin and stubbornness since then. 14. She'd left with 18. The 4 she hadn't brought back were always at the edge of her peripheral vision, the way the dead stay with you. Not haunting, exactly, but present. Witnesses. The helicopter dropped the last 50 feet and the tires kissed the tarmac harder than anyone wanted. Maya exhaled. Around her, she heard the sounds of men who'd been holding themselves together for too long finally starting to let go. A long breath. A sound that wasn't quite a sob. Hands that had been balled into fists for days slowly opening. "We're down," the crew chief announced into the intercom. Statement of fact. No congratulation in it. Maya was already looking through the porthole. She'd expected medical teams. That was standard extraction protocol. EMTs staged at the landing zone for high-casualty returns, gurneys if needed, a triage tent. She'd expected the brief chaotic warmth of base after the field, the smell of diesel and cafeteria food, someone pressing a cup of bad coffee into her hand. What she saw instead were headlights. 3 vehicles parked at the edge of the tarmac. Dark SUVs, not the standard olive-drab base transport. Men standing in front of them in body armor, their faces unreadable at this distance. And Colonel Ethan Caldwell, standing slightly apart from the rest, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the helicopter like he'd been waiting there all night. Maya's stomach dropped before her brain fully processed why. She'd known Caldwell for 6 years. She knew his posture. She knew the particular set of his jaw when he was performing authority rather than exercising it. She'd seen it in briefings, in command reviews, in the long, tense silences before he assigned someone to a mission they weren't going to come back from. She knew what it meant when he stood like that. She knew this wasn't a welcome. The door came open and the cold hit her first. A flat, damp cold that smelled like aviation fuel and wet grass. November on the base. She stepped down onto the tarmac and straightened to her full height, which wasn't impressive by any standard measure, 5'4" with her boots on. But she'd learned a long time ago that height had nothing to do with the space you occupied. She walked toward him. Behind her, she could hear the crew chief beginning to assist the first of her soldiers off the helicopter, and she kept her eyes forward, kept walking, kept her face neutral in the way that cost her more effort than it used to. Caldwell waited until she was 8 feet away, and then he spoke. "Commander Reynolds." "Colonel?" She let a beat pass. Sir, I need medical personnel staged immediately. I have... That's being handled. It wasn't. There were no EMTs on the tarmac. She could see that clearly from where she stood. My soldiers need... Commander. His voice came out flat and precise, the verbal equivalent of a door slamming. You are not in a position to make requests right now. She stopped walking. Excuse me? Caldwell's jaw moved, just slightly. The tell he never quite eliminated. You are being placed under investigative hold pending a formal inquiry into the conduct of your unit during Operation Clearwater. The words arrived one by one, each of them separate, and for a fraction of a second Maya's brain refused to assemble them into meaning. Then they hit. Under investigative hold. She said it back to him without inflection. That is correct. Colonel, I have 14 soldiers on that aircraft. At least 6 require immediate. They'll be assessed. He turned slightly, gesturing to one of the men in body armor. Sidearm, please, Commander. Badge and credentials as well. She didn't move. In her peripheral vision, she could see the men with him, 4 of them, military police by their markings, spread in a loose half circle. Not threatening, not yet, just present. The geometry of controlled situations. You're arresting me, she said. Investigative hold. There is a distinction. I've been behind enemy lines for 17 days. Her voice stayed level with the kind of effort that leaves marks you can't see. I brought 14 soldiers home. 4 of my people died. Something moved through her chest when she said it, a familiar weight that she'd learned to carry without showing. And you are standing on this runway with MPs. The inquiry will address all of those matters. What inquiry? Based on what? Based on the multiple mission failures documented in the preliminary report. What preliminary report? Filed by whom? I've been in the field, Commander. His voice dropped half a register, the tone that was meant to communicate finality. Your sidearm, now. The tarmac was quiet except for the winding down of the helicopter's rotors, the distant sound of her soldiers being helped down behind her, someone suppressing a grunt of pain, boots on metal. Maya unholstered her weapon and held it grip first toward him, slowly, by the numbers, with the deliberate care of someone who wanted every motion on whatever cameras might be recording. He took it. He didn't look at her when he did. She pulled her badge and credentials from her vest pocket and held them out. He took those too. The interrogation room was in Building 7, which housed base security and administrative processing. She'd been in this building once before, 2 years ago, to file paperwork on a subordinate's disciplinary matter. She remembered the smell. Industrial cleaner, old carpet, the particular stuffiness of rooms that never got natural air. The room they put her in was small, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency that would eventually make your teeth hurt, a mirror on the east wall that wasn't fooling anyone. They left her there. No water, no explanation, no timeline. She sat down, put her hands flat on the table, and did the thing she'd learned to do in every bad situation she'd ever been in. She got quiet inside. Not calm, exactly, just still. The kind of stillness that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with not wasting energy until you knew where to spend it. The preliminary report. That was the phrase that snagged in her mind and wouldn't let go. A preliminary report took time to prepare. Even a rushed one, even a politically motivated one, took hours. It required someone with access to operational documents, communication logs, the mission brief. It required someone sitting down and constructing a narrative with specific intent. She had landed 40 minutes ago. The report already existed. That meant it had been written before she came back. Before anyone knew she was coming back, or what condition her unit would be in, or what had actually happened on the ground during Operation Clearwater. Someone had written a report on a mission that hadn't ended yet. Maya stared at the surface of the metal table and let that fact settle. This had been prepared. She lost track of time in the room, the way you do when there's no window, and the lights don't change and no one comes. She'd been awake for 31 hours at minimum. The math on that was approximate because she'd been running on adrenaline for most of the extraction, and adrenaline has a way of compressing time. Her shoulder ached. Her ribs ached. She was hungry in the deep, hollow way that comes from sustained caloric deficit, not the ordinary inconvenience of a missed meal. She was making herself think through the operational sequence. Day 1, Day 2, reconstruction from memory, holding the chronology together like evidence, when the door opened. It wasn't an MP, it was Aaron Mitchell. He came in sideways, half leaning against the doorframe, and she could see immediately that someone had tried to process him through medical. His shoulder was properly bandaged now, a clean white dressing over the shrapnel wound, his arm held close to his body in a way that looked less voluntary than protective. He looked terrible. He also looked furious. "How did you get in here?" she said. "Told the MP I needed to use the bathroom, and the only one on this wing was next to your room." He let the door close behind him, quietly, intentionally. "I've got maybe 3 minutes. Mitchell, they're making us sign statements." He didn't lower his voice enough, and she watched him register that and correct it, the words coming out quieter but no less hard. "Caldwell's people. They came to medical while they were treating us. Paperwork already prepared. They want signatures saying we lost 4 men due to command failure, due to your decision-making in the field." Maya didn't say anything. "Nobody signed," Mitchell continued. "I want you to know that. Garrett can barely hold a pen right now, and he still wouldn't touch it. Ramos told the guy where he could put the paperwork, and I won't repeat the exact phrasing." A ghost of something moved across his face. Not a smile. Something more exhausted than a smile. "But they're going to keep pushing. Caldwell's been in and out of the medical wing twice already. He's—" Mitchell paused. "He's not asking anymore. He's telling." "What's he saying?" "That the inquiry is going to go hard on all of us if there's no cooperation. That cooperation looks good to review boards." Mitchell shifted his weight, winced. That kind of thing. Maya absorbed this, looked at the table, looked at Mitchell. "How's Garrett?" she asked. "He'll make it." Mitchell said it without the usual qualifications, which was probably as honest an answer as anyone had. "They all will. You got them back." "4 didn't come back?" "Reynolds." He said her name in this tone of someone who'd had this conversation before, or the beginning of it. "Don't. I'm not." She wasn't. She knew the difference between accountability and self-destruction, and right now she needed the former and couldn't afford the latter. "The communications from day 6, the extraction requests." Mitchell's eyes sharpened. "When I filed the first emergency extraction request," she said carefully, "what system did it go through?" He thought about it. The calculation behind his eyes was visible. He was tracking where she was going. Aaron Mitchell had 12 years in, and he wasn't slow. "Classified command relay," he said. "SCARLET protocol. And SCARLET logs traffic. Everything gets logged. That's the whole point of—" He stopped. Blinked. "Reynolds. Every transmission, in and out, date, time, content. Stored in the archive until it's formally purged, and purging requires a command order with 2 counter-signatures." Mitchell was very still. "The extraction request went through SCARLET," she said. "The response came through SCARLET. The denials." She looked at him directly. "Caldwell's denials." The door handle moved. Mitchell straightened, turned, put his back against the wall in the casual way of someone who'd been leaning there for a while when the MP opened the door and looked in. "Chief, you need to be in medical. Just checking on my CO." Mitchell's voice came out smooth and unconcerned, the voice of someone who'd been around long enough to know how to stand still and look harmless. "On my way." He walked out. The door closed. Maya put her hands back on the table and stared at them. SCARLET. Caldwell had built this case on reports and paperwork and the pressure of rank. He had the command chain. He had the documentation. He had the narrative he'd started writing before she even landed. What he didn't have, what he apparently hadn't thought about, in the particular blindness of men who believe their own authority is sufficient protection, was that his voice was on a tape. Every order he'd given, every denial, every word. She thought about day 6. She thought about the moment she'd keyed the radio and made the call she'd made, knowing it might be the only one anyone ever heard from her team. The words precise and controlled because she'd trained herself to keep them that way, even when everything around her was burning. Clearwater actual to command. Emergency extraction request. Grid reference follows. We have 4 WIA, 1 critical. Requesting immediate air support. Over. And then Caldwell's voice coming back through the static, clipped and final. Extraction denied. Weather restriction in effect. Hold position. She remembered looking up at the sky. Clear, cold, Stars from horizon to horizon. No storm, no weather restriction, no reason. Just the voice of a man making a decision about who would live and die from a warm room 800 miles away. She had challenged him. She had used every protocol she knew. She had requested escalation, requested override, requested acknowledgement that she was hearing him correctly. All of it on record, all of it going through SCARLET's unblinking archive. He had denied every request. And then, on day 8, she'd stopped requesting and started moving. They left her in the room for 6 hours before anyone came with any official presence. The man who came was a JAG officer named Captain Hollis, young enough that Maya suspected this was not the assignment he'd hoped to draw. He had the look of someone who'd been handed a situation he didn't fully understand and had been told to manage it anyway. He set a folder on the table between them and sat down. "Commander Reynolds, I'm Captain Hollis, Judge Advocate General's office. I'm here to inform you of the formal charges and your rights under—" "What are the charges?" He blinked. "I was about to— Captain, I've been awake for—" She did the math, approximately 37 hours. "I have an infected shoulder and 2 cracked ribs, and I've been sitting in this room without water since 04:30. Tell me the charges." Hollis looked at his folder, looked at her, opened the folder. "Dereliction of duty," he said. "Failure to execute tactical objectives. Unauthorized deviation from mission parameters. Contributing to the death of 4 personnel under your command." He paused. Then, quieter. "And conduct unbecoming of an officer." The last one was the addition that it told you everything. It was the charge that meant nothing specific and could mean anything at all. A catch-all, a club, something to attach when the actual charges might not stick. "Is there a duty attorney available?" "Yes, ma'am. I can get them here." "Of course." Hollis closed the folder. He started to rise, then stopped. He did something she didn't expect. He looked at her directly, without the managed professional distance he'd come in wearing. "Commander, for what it's worth." He stopped, seemed to reconsider, then said it anyway. "Some of the guys from your unit are still in the medical wing. They've been—" Another pause. "Vocal." "Vocal how?" "Refusing to be discharged until they talk to someone about what they're signing." He picked up the folder. "It's causing some administrative difficulty." He left. Maya sat back in her chair. 14 soldiers, 6 cracked ribs between them, 1 who could barely hold a pen. And none of them had signed. She thought about what that cost. Not just physically. She knew what kind of men Caldwell surrounded himself with, knew the particular flavor of institutional pressure he could bring to bear. The implication that careers would be reviewed, that medical histories would be scrutinized, that the path to a quiet and decent end of service required cooperation with the process. And not one of them had touched the paperwork. The buzzing fluorescent light overhead had developed a flicker in the past hour, irregular, like a pulse. Maya watched it for a moment. Thought about Aaron Mitchell's shoulder. Thought about Garrett, 19 years old, who'd gone 8 days without adequate sleep and come out the other side still functioning, still counting on her to have a plan. She needed the SCARLET archive. She needed someone outside Caldwell's chain of command who could pull it before anyone thought to file the purge order. She needed to move fast. The problem was that she was sitting in a locked room, and the only card she'd been given was a JAG officer who looked like he'd graduated 18 months ago, and a theory that the man who'd built this case against her had accidentally recorded himself doing it. The door handle turned again. Maya straightened. The MP who opened the door was not the one who'd been stationed outside earlier. This one was younger, and he held the door open in a way that didn't match the posture of someone delivering routine information. He was holding himself carefully, the way people do when they're doing something they're not entirely sure about. In his other hand was a paper cup of water. He set it on the table without making eye contact. "Your attorney's been requested," he said, and then, lower, barely audible. "Chief Mitchell asked me to tell you the name Daniel Cross. Said you'd know what that means." He walked out. The door clicked shut. Maya looked at the cup of water, picked it up, drank half of it in one motion. Daniel Cross. She did know the name. Cross was a defense operations specialist, one of the people who worked in the architecture of classified communications, specifically the kind of work that sat at the intersection of technical systems and legal oversight. He was meticulous. He was cautious. He worked within proper channels because he understood the proper channels better than almost anyone. More importantly, he had no operational relationship with Caldwell, different command structure entirely. If Mitchell had gotten word to Cross, and that was a significant if, given that Mitchell was currently being monitored in a military medical bay while recovering from a shrapnel wound, then Cross might already be moving. If he was moving, the Scarlet Archive had a chance. If the archive had a chance, Caldwell's carefully constructed preliminary report was built on sand. Maya put the paper cup down. Outside the door, she heard voices. Two men, the cadence of an argument being conducted at a controlled volume. The words weren't clear through the door, but the shape of the argument was familiar. Authority asserting itself, someone pushing back. The particular rhythm of an institutional dispute that hadn't yet escalated to something that would require paperwork. Then the voices went quiet. Then the door opened. Standing in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize. Mid-40s, civilian clothes, a laptop bag over one shoulder, looking like someone who'd been roused from a dead sleep and driven 40 minutes, and was going to need a significant explanation before he decided whether or not to be angry about it. Commander Reynolds. He didn't offer a hand. He stepped inside, pulled the door closed behind him, and set his bag on the table. My name is Daniel Cross. Aaron Mitchell reached me 40 minutes ago through a contact we share. Maya looked at him. I work in classified communications architecture, he continued. Specifically, the maintenance and oversight of secure archive systems. He unzipped the bag, pulled out a laptop, set it on the table between them. Including SCARLET. The fluorescent light above them flickered once. Held. I need to know, Cross said quietly, every transmission date and time you can remember. Because if what Mitchell told me is accurate, he paused, chose the next word deliberately, then what's in that archive isn't just your defense. His hands were on the laptop keyboard. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the screen, and something in the way he held himself, careful, precise, the controlled focus of someone who understood the full weight of what they were about to do, told Maya he'd already thought through everything this could cost him. It's evidence, he said. The laptop screen cast pale light across the metal table between them. Maya leaned forward, and she did. She gave him everything she could reconstruct from memory, not just dates and times, which she'd been mentally cataloging since the moment Caldwell opened his mouth on the runway, but the precise sequencing of transmissions, the language of each request, the exact phrasing Caldwell had used in his responses. She'd spent 17 days in the field keeping meticulous mental records, because paperwork burned and radios got destroyed, and sometimes the only archive that survived was the one inside your own skull. Cross typed without interrupting her. He asked clarifying questions when he needed to. Grid reference format, whether she'd used primary or secondary SCARLET channel for the day. 8 escalation, the specific call sign she'd been assigned for Operation Clearwater. And the questions were precise enough that she understood quickly he wasn't learning the system while she talked. He already knew the system. He was building a search index. Day 6, she said, primary channel, approximately 240 hours local, first emergency extraction request. And Caldwell's response came through the same channel? Same channel, same protocol. He didn't reroute. He answered directly. Cross's fingers paused on the keyboard for just a moment, then continued. That's important. Rerouting would have created a secondary log. Answering directly means everything is in the primary archive under a single event thread. He looked at the screen. That's actually cleaner. Cleaner. Easier to pull. Less interpretation required. The thread speaks for itself. Maya watched him work. How long to access it? Access isn't the problem. I minimized one window, opened another. I have authorization to query the archive for systems maintenance purposes. That's a standing credential. Doesn't require a new request. Doesn't flag on the command dashboard. He paused. Pulling a specific event thread and copying it to a separate secure location with a full chain of custody record attached, so it can't be challenged as tampered evidence. Another pause. Shorter. That takes longer. And it requires a second authorizing signature. Who? Cross looked at her across the laptop screen. Someone outside Caldwell's operational jurisdiction. Inspector General's office, ideally, or a JAG officer with sufficient clearance and no conflict of interest. Maya thought about Captain Hollis. Young, uncertain. But he told her about the soldiers in the medical bay, the ones who were being vocal, who were refusing discharge. He hadn't needed to tell her that. It hadn't been part of his job. "There's a JAG officer named Hollis," she said. "I know Hollis." Cross said it neutrally, which told her nothing. "He was assigned to this case today, this morning." "Assigned by whom?" "Officially, by the JAG rotation roster." Cross looked at the screen again. "Unofficially, I don't know yet." The qualifier sat between them. Maya let it sit. "Can you reach him?" she asked. "I can try." Cross pulled out his phone, looked at it, put it back down. "Not from in here. This is almost certainly being monitored. Audio, at minimum. Visual too, probably." He closed the laptop partway. "I need to be somewhere with a secured line and a reason to be there that doesn't look like what I'm actually doing." "The system's maintenance authorization." "Yes." He stood, shouldered the bag. "It gives me legitimate reason to be in the archive facility. A maintenance query creates a logged reason for my presence that's clean on its face." He looked at her. Something passed across his expression. Not doubt exactly, more like the weight of full comprehension settling in. "If Caldwell has already requested a purge order on these transmissions, we have a narrow window. Purge orders require 2 counter-signatures, which buys time, but if he filed it before your helicopter landed..." "He filed the preliminary report before I landed." The sentence landed in the room, and Cross absorbed it without visible reaction, but his jaw shifted slightly, like something clicking into place. "Then I need to move now," he said. He went to the door, put his hand on the handle, then stopped. "Reynolds." He didn't turn around. "Mitchell told me about the mission, what you did on day 11. A pause. "Getting those men out through the secondary corridor after the primary route was blown." Another pause. "He said you went back in twice." Maya didn't say anything. "I'm telling you that because I want you to understand I'm not doing this as a favor to anyone." He opened the door. "I'm doing it because some things matter." He walked out. The door closed and the room went back to its fluorescent buzz and its metal walls and its bolted-down table. Maya sat for a moment in the specific silence of someone who has just handed off the only card they had and now had nothing to do but wait. She hated waiting. She'd always hated it. More than the cold, more than the hunger, more than the close-quarters work that most people imagined would be the hard part. Waiting was its own discipline, and it was the one she'd never entirely mastered. She could sit still, she could control her breathing, she could keep her expression neutral in a room full of people reading her, but something underneath her skin was always moving. She turned her attention to the only productive thing available, thinking through Caldwell's position. He had a preliminary report. He had documentation. Whatever he'd assembled or constructed over the 17 days she was in the field. He had rank and command authority, which in the institutional language of the military translated to credibility that took significant evidence to override. He had witnesses, or people he believed were witnesses, her soldiers, who he was pressuring to sign statements. What he didn't have was the statements. Not yet. Because 14 men with injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to dehydration and psychological trauma had collectively decided that the paperwork could find somewhere else to be. She thought about why that mattered. Not just emotionally. She understood why it mattered emotionally, was trying not to think about it that way because the emotional weight of it would cost her something she needed. But tactically, Caldwell needed those signatures. Without them, his narrative was one colonel's word against a returned unit's collective memory. And collective memory was messy and human and harder to control than typed statements with names at the bottom. He was applying pressure, which meant he was worried, which meant he knew, on some level, that the story he was telling had holes in it. The JAG attorney arrived at close to noon. Not Captain Hollis, someone else, a woman, Major Sandra Voss, who came in with her own folder and a recorder, and the brisk efficiency of someone who billed her time carefully, even when time wasn't technically being billed. She sat down across from Maya, opened the folder, and looked at her with the specific expression of a person who has read a file and formed a working theory and is now adjusting that theory in real time based on the person actually in front of her. "You look like hell," she said. "I've had a difficult couple of weeks," Maya said. 17 days behind enemy lines with 14 survivors. Voss looked back at her folder. "I've read the preliminary report. Colonel Caldwell's version. The only version currently on file, yes." Voss turned a page. It characterizes your decision-making on Day 3 as unilateral deviation from mission parameters, Day 8 as unauthorized tactical withdrawal, Day 11 as, she paused, reading, reckless endangerment of personnel under your command. Maya's hands on the table were very still. Day 11, she said, was when I went back into a collapsed corridor twice to pull out 2 soldiers who would have died in there. With no support, because my support element was holding a perimeter against 6 hostiles with 3 functional weapons between them. Voss looked at her. I'm not asking for your account of it yet, she said. I'm telling you what the document says so you understand what we're working against. She turned another page. The charges are serious, Commander. Taken together, they represent a career-ending package. At minimum, at maximum, depending on how the inquiry goes, we're talking about court-martial. The words sat on this table between them like something heavy. I know, Maya said. The preliminary report is thorough. Voss said it without judgment, which was its own kind of precision. Whoever prepared it, and I have questions about the timeline of its preparation, which we'll come back to, took care to source each allegation to operational documentation, mission logs, communication records from the base side, personnel reports. What communication records? Voss glanced up. Summaries of transmission traffic from Operation Clearwater, referenced in the appendix as SCARLET derived. Something moved through Maya's chest, carefully controlled. Summaries, she said. That's what the appendix references. Not transcripts, summaries. Summaries could be edited. Summaries required someone to interpret the raw content and render it into prose, and in that rendering, things could be omitted, emphasized, reframed. Is it standard to use summaries, Maya asked, rather than primary transcripts? Voss considered the question with the precision of someone who understood exactly why it was being asked. It's not unusual. Primary transcripts from SCARLET are classified at a level that complicates direct inclusion in an investigative file. Summaries allow the relevant information to be included without requiring the full classification handling. And if the summaries don't accurately represent the primary transcripts, the room was quiet. That, Voss said, would be a significant problem for the document that contains them. She looked at Maya directly. Is there a reason to believe the summaries are inaccurate? There's a reason to believe the primary transcripts would tell a different story than what's in that report. Maya held the Major's gaze. A materially different story, including communications that directly contradict the characterization of my decisions as unilateral and unauthorized. Voss was quiet for a moment. Her pen was on the table, but she wasn't using it. Are you telling me you have communications that would support your account? I'm telling you, the raw SCARLET archive contains a complete record of every transmission during Operation Clearwater, including requests I made and responses that came back through command. Maya paused. Including denials. Another beat. What kind of denials? Voss asked. Extraction requests. Emergency classification. Denied by Colonel Caldwell on multiple occasions while I had critically wounded personnel in the field. The Major's expression didn't change in a dramatic way. Nothing moved that didn't have a reason to move. But something behind her eyes went very focused, very specific, the way a person's attention concentrates when something they didn't expect turns out to matter more than everything else in the room. On record, Voss said. It wasn't quite a question. On SCARLET. Primary archive. Not summary. Maya let that land. Caldwell's voice, his authorization code, time-stamped to the minute. Voss picked up her pen. I need you to tell me everything, she said. From the beginning, every transmission you made and every response you received, in sequence, with whatever detail you can provide. She looked up. And I need the name of anyone who might currently be working to access the primary archive before a purge order can be processed. Daniel Cross, Maya said. He should be in the archive facility right now. The afternoon passed in the particular way that institutional time passes, in long, slow stretches punctuated by brief, sharp moments, like bad weather interspersed with unsettling calm. Voss left to make calls. An MP brought Maya a meal at some point, base cafeteria food, which under normal circumstances she would have eaten without noticing, and which she now ate with the concentrated attention of someone who understood the caloric math of what her body had been through. She drank 2 more cups of water. Her shoulder had stopped actively hurting and settled into the duller, more sustainable ache that meant the infection was either responding to the antibiotics someone had apparently put into the medical kit she'd been given, or it wasn't, and either way, there was nothing she could do about it right now. She thought about her soldiers. She thought about Garrett, specifically. Not because he was the youngest, Okafor was 6 months younger, but because on day 14 he'd looked at her in the particular way that people look at you when they've decided to trust you, past the point where trust is reasonable, past the point where it makes calculated sense, past the point of evidence, and into something more basic. He'd looked at her like that on day 14, and she'd looked back and she'd told him, and this was the unpolished version, the field version, not the version from any manual. We're going home. It's going to take a few more days and it's going to be bad before it gets better, but we're going home. She hadn't known that for certain when she said it. She'd needed it to be true, which was different. It had turned out to be true, which was different again. The 4 who didn't come home had different stories. Peterson on day 2, hit before they even understood the extent of their situation. Alvarez on day 5, internal bleeding she didn't have the equipment to address. Cho and Marsh on day 9, when the secondary extraction corridor turned out to be covered, and she'd gotten the others out and come back for Cho and Marsh. And it had been too late by 40 minutes, maybe less. She'd reconstructed that timeline 17 times in 17 nights, and she couldn't close the gap below 40 minutes, and she didn't know if she ever would. Caldwell's report called it command failure. She called it 40 minutes. The distinction was the entire case. Captain Hollis came back in the late afternoon. He knocked before he entered, which wasn't required in an interrogation hold, and suggested something about the way he was approaching this. He came in with his folder and an additional document she hadn't seen before. A single page, folded once. Major Voss briefed me, he said. He sat down, set the folder aside and put the folded page on the table between them without opening it. I want you to understand I have some obligations here that may feel like they're working against you. I understand your obligations, Maya said. I'm not sure you do, completely. He looked at his hands, then at her. I was assigned to this case by roster rotation. That's standard. What's not standard is that 3 hours after I was assigned, I received a call from Colonel Caldwell's executive officer asking about the timeline of the investigation and whether certain communications would be introduced into evidence. He paused. That call was unusual enough that I logged it, officially. Maya was still. I'm telling you that, Hollis continued, because I want you to understand the full shape of what's happening. He picked up the folded page and placed it more precisely on the table, the way you'd place something you'd thought about before placing. And because you have a right to know what's in this. She unfolded it. It was a query result. Official letterhead, archive reference number at the top, the kind of document that came from a system rather than from a person. The text was technical, system notation, timestamp format, authorization codes, but she could parse enough of it. SCARLET archive access log. Flagged entries. 2 purge requests, logged within 6 hours of each other, both referencing Operation Clearwater event threads. The first request had been filed 14 hours ago. The counter-signature requirement had been triggered, stalling it. The second had been filed 4 hours ago, with an attached authority citation. Maya didn't recognize by number. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, access query executed 1544 by authorized maintenance credential, cross, D. Event thread copy in progress to secure external location. Maya looked at the timestamp. Cross had gotten in. He was copying the archive right now, and Caldwell had tried twice to erase it. The second purge request, Hollis said. I need to know if you recognize the authority citation. He pointed to the reference number on the page. She looked at it carefully, looked at the format, the prefix codes. The first 2 letters of the authority designator were CC. Command chain, not unusual. The number that followed was a command-level code she'd seen in operational documents before, but the authority prefix after that. 3 letters. Not a command designation. Her eyes moved to Hollis. That authority prefix, she said slowly, that's not a field command designation. No, Hollis said. He was watching her. It's not. It's an oversight committee code. She looked at the page again to make sure she was reading it correctly. Someone from the oversight committee filed that second purge request. That is what the document indicates. Caldwell doesn't sit on the oversight committee. No, Hollis said. He doesn't. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, held. Maya set the page down. If Caldwell had gone to someone on the oversight committee to file a second purge request, And the only reason to file a second purge request within 4 hours of the first was because the first hadn't moved fast enough. Then this was not a colonel protecting his career. A colonel protecting his career doesn't have oversight committee contacts willing to file classified purge requests with his authority citation attached. A colonel protecting his career doesn't have a network. "How long has he been on this base?" she asked. "Caldwell? 4 years at Redstone, 8 months as base commander." "Before that?" Hollis looked at his folder. "Brunt Denning, 2 years. Before that, Camp Ashford." He turned a page. "Camp Ashford, 3 years." She knew Camp Ashford. Not well, but enough. It was a forward operating post, significant in its time, not the kind of assignment that made careers. Unless you were the kind of officer who used postings like that for purposes other than what the posting was officially for. "I want to know if there were any operations at Camp Ashford during his tenure," she said, "with similar operational outcomes. Specifically, denied extractions. Missions that went wrong in ways that were officially attributed to field conditions." Hollis looked at her steadily. He had the expression of someone who was deciding whether to cross a line and deciding and doing it. "There's a name," he said, "that came up when I was reviewing the case file this morning, not in the main document, in a reference footnote in the appendix." He found the page. "Sergeant Lucas Bennett, killed in action 14 months ago during an operation out of Camp Ashford." Maya hadn't heard the name before. "The death was attributed to adverse weather conditions that prevented extraction," Hollis said. He paused. "The official record indicates the weather restriction was called by the commanding officer on duty." Something very cold moved through the room. "And who was the commanding officer on duty that night?" Maya asked, even though some part of her already knew. Hollis's jaw moved. He looked down at the page, then up at her. "Colonel Ethan Caldwell," he said. The word didn't echo. The room was too small for that, but Maya felt it settle into the space between them with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said for 14 months. The name of a man who had died trusting a voice on a radio that told him help wasn't coming. Outside in the corridor, she heard footsteps. More than one person, moving with purpose. Hollis heard it too. He closed his folder, started to stand, then stopped. Looked at her one more time with something in his expression that wasn't quite professional neutrality. "Cross needs about another 40 minutes, he said quietly. "That's what Major Voss estimates." The footsteps outside were getting closer. "Who's coming?" Maya asked. "Based on the authorization citation on that second purge request?" Hollis picked up the folder. "Probably someone who doesn't want to wait 40 minutes. The door handle moved. The door opened on a man Maya had never seen before. He was tall, 50s, in civilian clothes that were expensive without being obvious about it. The kind of clothes that said the person wearing them hadn't thought about money in a long time. He had the particular bearing of someone who'd spent years in rooms where decisions were made and had gradually come to believe that his presence in a room was itself a kind of decision. Behind him were 2 men who were not quite security and not quite aides and were clearly both. He looked at Hollis first. "Captain, you can step out." Hollis didn't move immediately, which was small but noted. "Sir, I'm currently in an active consultation with—" "Step out, Captain." Hollis looked at Maya. She gave him nothing, kept her face neutral, kept her hands flat on the table, kept her breathing even. He picked up his folder and left, and the door closed behind him with the soft click of something that felt more final than it should have. The man sat down across from her. His 2 associates stayed standing, one near the door, one to Maya's right. She clocked their positions without looking directly at either of them. "Commander Reynolds?" He said her name like he was confirming a fact he already knew. "My name is Warren Steele. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Armed Forces Oversight Subcommittee." She said nothing. "I want to have a candid conversation with you," Steele said. "Off the record." "There's a camera in this room," she said. "There was." He let that settle, then moved on before she could react to it. "I've been briefed on the situation. The investigation, the charges, the unit's current status." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm also aware of some additional activity that occurred this afternoon in relation to the SCARLET archive." The room didn't change temperature. It felt like it did. "I want you to understand something," Steele continued. "Colonel Caldwell is an important operational asset. His work over the past several years has contributed to outcomes that matter at a level well above base command. What happens to his career? and more specifically, what happens to his reputation during an inquiry process, has implications that extend beyond what you might be considering right now. Maya looked at him. Really looked at him. The careful evenness of his delivery, the way he sat with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd never been in a room where the outcome wasn't already determined before he walked in. The way he said important operational asset, the way someone else might say person. "You're here to offer me something," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise to recalculation. "I'm here to present options," he said. "The charges against you carry significant weight. A formal court-martial process is lengthy, adversarial, and public in ways that would be damaging regardless of outcome." He paused. "There's an alternative path. A quiet resolution. Charges reduced, record sealed, full medical benefits retained. You'd be discharged honorably. The inquiry closes." She let the silence run for a moment. "And the SCARLET archive," she said, "would be handled appropriately within established classification protocols." Handled. The word did a lot of work. "And my soldiers?" she asked. "The ones currently in the medical bay refusing to sign statements that misrepresent what happened on that mission? Their service records would reflect honorable completion of Operation Clearwater." "That's not what I asked." Steele unfolded his hands and refolded them, and she recognized the gesture. It was what people did when they were deciding how direct to be. "Your soldiers follow the lead of their commanding officer," he said. "If that officer reaches an accommodation, the unit typically follows." There it was. Not a threat, exactly. Not anything she could quote back to him in a room with no cameras and no recorder. Just the clean institutional logic of how pressure worked, applied to the top, distributed down, outcome achieved, without anyone having to say the ugly version of what they meant. Maya looked at the surface of the table. She thought about Garrett, 19 years old, who hadn't spoken a full sentence since day 9. She thought about Sergeant Lucas Bennett, whose name had been in a footnote. She thought about a woman somewhere who'd spent 14 months believing her son died because the weather was bad. "No," she said. Steele was quiet. "I want to be clear," Maya said. "Not as a negotiating position, not as an opening to a counteroffer. No, full stop." Something moved across Steele's face that was the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him. Not anger, not surprise, but the particular expression of a person recalibrating a situation they believed they had mapped correctly and discovering the map was wrong. "Commander," he said, "I don't think you fully appreciate the position you're in." "I appreciate it clearly." Her voice stayed level. "I also appreciate that you filed a second purge request on the SCARLET archive 4 hours ago, which tells me the first one didn't move fast enough, which tells me you know what's in that archive and you know what it does to the story." "Colonel Caldwell has been building for 17 days. She held his gaze. "So I'd push back on the idea that I'm the one who doesn't understand the position." Steele looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. "Think about what I've said," he said. "The offer has a window. Close the door on your way out," Maya said. "Patang." He did. Maya sat in the room alone and let herself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't composure. Her hands were shaking slightly, the small tremor of sustained adrenaline that had nowhere to go, and she pressed them flat against the table and breathed through it. The shoulder ached. The ribs ached. The fluorescent light buzzed its irregular buzz. Then she pulled herself back together, piece by piece, the way she'd been doing it for 17 days. Steele's visit told her several things. First, the second purge request had not yet succeeded. If the archive had already been purged, he wouldn't be in this room offering accommodations. He'd be in a different room watching the charges proceed without opposition. Second, Cross was still working. 40 minutes, Hollis had said. That had been, she calculated, maybe 20 minutes ago, conservatively. Third, Steele had come here himself. Deputy chair of a subcommittee did not personally visit interrogation holds at naval bases to talk to detained commanders unless the situation warranted personal attention. That level of personal attention meant the stakes were higher than one colonel's career. It meant there were other names behind Caldwell's name, other connections, other decisions that would unravel if the thread got pulled. She needed to know how far the thread went. The door opened again, and this time it was Voss, moving fast, with Hollis behind her. Cross finished, Voss said. She sat down and put a hard drive case on the table. Small, matte black, the kind of case designed for things that needed to stay intact through rough handling. 41 minutes. Complete event thread for Operation Clearwater. Primary SCARLET archive. Chain of custody documentation attached. 2 copies. One to a secure offsite server. One physical. Maya looked at the case. Steele was just here, she said. Voss didn't look surprised. Hollis did, slightly. What did he offer? Voss asked. Quiet discharge, sealed record, full benefits. And? I told him no. Voss looked at her with an expression that was not quite approval. It was more complicated than that. The look of someone who respected a decision they also recognized was going to make everything harder. All right, she said, then we move fast. The second purge request is being contested through JAG on the grounds that it was filed using an authority citation outside the appropriate command jurisdiction for this class of archived material. She opened her folder. That's a procedural argument, and it buys us time, not a permanent solution. We need to get the archive content formally entered into the investigative record before the purge order clears the review process. How long does the review process take? Normally, 72 hours minimum, but Steele's office has resources. So we have less than 72 hours. Realistically, we have tonight. Maya looked at the hard drive case, at Voss, at Hollis, who was standing near the door with his folder and the expression of someone who'd started the day thinking he'd been handed a routine case and was now standing in something considerably less routine. Play it, Maya said. Voss looked at her. The archive. I want to hear it. Reynolds? I want to hear his voice saying it. She kept her voice even. I need to know exactly what we have before we put it in front of anyone else. Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached for the hard drive case. The playback came through a laptop Hollis produced from his own bag, connected to the drive, the audio file queued up through a basic media program with a timestamp display and no other ornamentation. The quality was what SCARLET always sounded like. Clean carrier signal, slight compression artifact, the background noise of whatever environment each speaker was transmitting from filtered down to a low hiss. Maya heard her own voice first. Clearwater actual to command. Emergency extraction request. Priority alpha. Grid reference. November 7. Echo 4. Approximate. We have 4 WIA. 1 critical. Requesting immediate air support. Acknowledge. Over. Her voice on the recording sounded different than she expected. Flatter. More controlled. She'd known she was keeping it controlled, but hearing it back, she could also hear what was underneath the control. The faint compression of someone who was managing a very large amount of adrenaline through a very narrow channel. Then the response. And there was Caldwell's voice. Clearwater actual. This is command. Extraction denied. Weather restriction in effect for your grid. Hold position and maintain operational security. Command out. The timestamp said 243 hours, day 6. The room was very quiet. Voss reached forward and hit pause. Nobody spoke for a moment. No weather restriction was in effect, Maya said. It wasn't for the room's benefit. She said it because saying it out loud made it a fact that existed in the air, not just in her memory. I had a functioning meteorological uplink. Skies were clear to 14,000 feet across the entire operational grid. That's documented? Voss asked. In the mission log. I entered it specifically because I didn't understand the denial. I wanted it on record that the stated reason didn't match observable conditions. Voss made a note. Continue the playback? Maya nodded. The recording ran forward. There was the second extraction request, day 7. Different language, more formal, escalation protocol invoked. Caldwell again. Command cannot authorize extraction under current conditions. Your unit is to hold position and await further instructions. The third request, day 8. Maya's voice now carried something that even the SCARLET compression couldn't fully flatten. A tightness that came from 2 days of watching a situation deteriorate while the channel back to command produced nothing but denials. That request had included the word override. She'd invoked the emergency override protocol that required a senior commanding officer's direct verbal authorization to deny. Caldwell's response to the override invocation. Clearwater actual. Override request acknowledged and denied. Weather restriction remains in effect. Hold position. Command out. Hollis made a sound that was barely audible, something between an exhale and something else, and controlled it quickly. There was more. There were the clarifying transmissions she'd sent, the ones where she'd pushed back directly against the denial in language that probably cost her professionally, even as she sent it, the ones where she'd stated clearly that she was questioning the operational basis for the restriction and requesting a secondary authorization. Caldwell's responses to those were shorter, clipped, the sound of a man who'd decided the conversation was over and was using his rank as punctuation. And then there was the moment on day 8, 340 hours, when she'd made the decision, no more requests. Her people were dying by increments and the channel was producing nothing, and she had a unit, and the unit had capabilities, and she was going to use them. Command, this is Clearwater Actual, unable to hold position, initiating independent extraction. Over. Caldwell's response, cold, immediate, and in the recording completely exposed. Clearwater. Actual, you are ordered to hold position. Any unauthorized movement will be treated as dereliction of duty. Acknowledge. Clearwater Actual, moving. That was the last transmission of the session. 8 words. Then silence. Voss stopped the playback. The three of them sat with it for a moment. Outside in the corridor, there was the ordinary ambient sound of a building in the mid-afternoon. Footsteps, a distant door, a phone ringing twice and stopping. His authorization code is on every denial, Hollis said. He said it quietly, like he was still processing. Voice and code both. That's not deniable. No, Voss agreed. She closed the laptop. It's not. Maya was looking at the table. She'd heard the recording, and it had done what she expected it to do. Confirmed what she'd known, made real what had only been memory, and it had also done something she hadn't quite prepared for, which was to make the 17 days smaller. Compressed. A sequence of transmissions and timestamps and denials, and then the sound of her own voice saying moving with all the finality of a door closing. There's more on the drive, Cross had apparently told Voss, because Voss was now reading something from the chain of custody document that had come with the files. He pulled the full Clearwater thread, Voss said, but he also flagged 2 adjacent event threads that cross-referenced the same command authorization codes. Maya looked up. Different operations, Voss said. She was reading carefully, one finger tracing the document. Different time period. Camp Ashford. The room went very still. He was pulling the Bennett operation, Maya said. He was pulling everything Caldwell's code touched in an emergency extraction context. Voss set the document down. There are 3 operations. Clearwater is the most recent. 14 months prior, there's an operation out of Camp Ashford, designator Fox Run, in which extraction was denied under weather restriction and resulted in the deaths of 3 personnel. She paused. 22 months prior, there's a 3rd operation, designator Millstone, same base, same denial pattern. Another pause. 2 deaths. The number sat in the room. 3 operations, 7 deaths, the same voice on the radio, the same authority code, the same stated reason, weather restriction, applied across different geographies, different conditions, different units who had trusted the voice coming back through their comms. Millstone and Fox Run, Hollis said. He was very still. Were they investigated? Fox Run received a command-level inquiry, Voss said, closed after 4 weeks, finding deaths attributable to adverse operational conditions. No disciplinary action. She turned the page. Millstone. No formal inquiry. Classified at base command level. Conclusion listed as mission casualties within acceptable operational parameters. Acceptable operational parameters. Maya looked at those words on the page across the table. She thought about what they meant. Not institutionally, not in the language of reports and findings, but in real terms. In terms of a sergeant named Bennett dying in a field while a clear sky opened over him. In terms of 2 men from Millstone, whose names she didn't even know yet, dying with the same false excuse ringing in their ears. Acceptable. He did this before, she said. Not surprise in it. Something colder. He knew how to do it. The language, the documentation, the way the inquiry got closed. He'd already run this play twice. By the time he used it on Clearwater, it was practiced. Voss was looking at her. Reynolds. He didn't just try to bury me. He built a system for burying people. Her hands were flat on the table and she was looking at a fixed point on the wall opposite. And the system worked twice before anyone came back alive. The silence held for a moment. Then Voss's phone buzzed on the table between them. She looked at it, read the notification. Her face did something contained and complicated. "The second purge request," she said. "It's been escalated above JAG review level. Steele's office is invoking Emergency National Security Classification Authority." Hollis looked up sharply. "Can he do that?" Maya asked. "He can file for it. It's not automatic. It requires a secondary authorization from the Oversight Committee chair." Voss was already typing on her phone. "But if the committee chair approves it, the purge happens regardless of the review process. 48 hours, maximum." "Then we need to move faster," Maya said. "I'm already reaching out to... not to anyone below the level that can counter Steele's authority." Maya's voice had changed. It wasn't louder. If anything, it was quieter, which in her experience was more effective than volume. "We have 3 operations, 7 deaths, and a recording of a colonel lying to a dying unit. That is not a JAG case anymore. That is not a base inquiry. Steele is trying to invoke national security classification to bury evidence in a murder investigation." The word landed hard. Hollis had gone very still. Voss put her phone down and looked at Maya directly. "If you call it that, what would you call it?" A pause. "I would call it," Voss said carefully, "a pattern of conduct resulting in preventable combat deaths, facilitated by fraudulent command orders and covered by misuse of classification authority." She held Maya's gaze. "Which, in legal terms, amounts to approximately the same thing." "Then who counters Steele?" Voss picked her phone back up. "There's one person on the Oversight Committee who isn't Steele's chair and who has sufficient seniority to demand a hold on the purge order pending formal review." She was scrolling. "General Richard Hale. He chairs the Armed Forces Ethics Subcommittee. He can't block the purge permanently, but he can demand a formal evidence review before any classified material is destroyed." She found what she was looking for. "It buys us a minimum of 7 days. Can you reach him?" "I can reach his office. Whether his office puts me through tonight is a different question." "Do it," Maya said, "right now, from this room." Voss looked at her phone, made the decision, put it to her ear. The call connected to an assistant, which was what Maya expected at this hour, and what followed was the careful, efficient language of someone who had learned to communicate urgency through professional channels without losing the urgency in the professionalism. Voss did this well, better than Maya could have. She listened to Voss lay out the essential framework: classified archive, pending purge order, 3 related operations, national security classification invocation being used to prevent evidence review. The assistant's voice was barely audible, but its rhythm changed mid-call, the cadence of someone writing things down faster. Voss ended the call, looked at Maya. "He's being briefed tonight." "How soon?" "I don't know. His assistant took everything, said the general would have a response before 2200. It was, by Maya's estimate, approximately 1730. She looked at the hard drive case on the table. "The physical copy," she said. "Where's it going?" "Secure off-site with Cross until we have a formal evidence hold in place." Voss hesitated. "There's a problem." "What problem?" "Cross left the archive facility 40 minutes ago." Voss's voice was careful. "He was supposed to check in with my contact when he cleared the building. He hasn't checked in." "Not yet." A pause that contained more than it showed. "It's probably nothing. The facility has 2 exits, and if he went through the secondary, how long since he was supposed to check in?" Voss looked at the time. Didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Maya stood up from the table. The movement was sudden enough that the MP outside the door registered it. She heard the shift of weight in the corridor, the small alert of someone reattending to their post. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "You're in investigative hold, Reynolds. You don't have—" "I need to make a phone call," she said again, the same quiet register, the same flatness that had exactly nothing to do with calm. "Daniel Cross is out there with the only physical copy of evidence that can put 7 deaths in front of a court. Steele's people know he pulled it, and he's missed his check-in." She looked at Voss without blinking. "I need a phone." Voss held her gaze. Then she put her phone on the table. The number Maya dialed belonged to a man named Reyes, who had been her unit's intelligence liaison for 3 years before transferring to a role she was not supposed to know the details of but knew anyway, because when you worked in the field long enough with someone, you learned how to read the spaces between what they said and what they meant. Reyes operated in the specific gray area between military intelligence and operational security, and one of the things he was good at was knowing where people were when they weren't supposed to be findable. He answered on the second ring. "I need a location on Daniel Cross," she said. "He cleared the SCARLET archive facility at Redstone approximately an hour ago. He's missed a check-in, and I have reason to believe Steele's people know what he's carrying." Silence on the line. Then, "You're calling me from your attorney's phone." "Yes." "Which means you're in an interrogation hold." "Also, yes." A pause. "The charge list they're running on you is creative." "I know. Cross Reyes, now." Another pause, longer, the sound of someone working through something quickly. "I don't have eyes on him, but I can get eyes on the facility exit logs and parking records in about 8 minutes. You want me to call this number back?" "Yes." "Reynolds." His voice changed to register. "Is it as bad as the charge sheet makes it look?" "It's worse," she said. "There are 2 other operations, Fox Run and Millstone, Camp Ashford. Caldwell's authorization code is on both." The silence on the line had a different quality now. 7 people, she said. 3 operations. Same lie every time. She heard him exhale. Just once. Then the professional register came back, the focused economy of someone shifting into a mode she recognized. 8 minutes. Stay on that number. She put the phone on the table. Voss and Hollis were watching her. "Who is Reyes?" Hollis asked. "Someone who can find Cross if finding is possible." She sat back down. Her shoulder was screaming now, the sustained adrenaline of the past hour having done what adrenaline does to wounds that needed rest, and instead kept getting jostled by the demands of a situation that showed no interest in allowing rest. The 8 minutes were the longest 8 minutes she'd spent since the night she'd crawled back into the collapsed corridor for Cho and Marsh and found 40 minutes instead of the men she'd gone in for. She used them the way she'd used those 40 minutes, not by sitting still, but by thinking forward. The archive was copied. Voss was in contact with Hale's office. The recordings existed on a server somewhere outside Caldwell's reach, outside Steele's reach. The physical copy was with Cross, and Cross's location was currently unknown, but Reyes was looking. What she had was enough to present to Hale. It might even be enough to present to the Oversight Committee directly if Hale's intervention created the opening. The recordings weren't just her defense. Voss had been right about that from the beginning. They were evidence of a pattern, and patterns, in military courts, carried weight that single incidents sometimes didn't. The phone buzzed. She picked it up. "He's at the North Gate," Reyes said, "sitting in his car. 2 vehicles behind him that pulled out of the facility parking structure about 4 minutes after he did, and haven't moved." A pause. "He's aware of them. He hasn't left the car. He's waiting." "Looks like it." Cross had gotten out of the facility with the drive and immediately picked up a tail, and he was smart enough to know that moving while being followed meant leading them somewhere. And he was sitting at the North Gate because the North Gate was a public checkpoint where nothing could happen to him or what he was carrying without witnesses and cameras. He was waiting for someone to come to him. "Can you get to him?" Maya asked. "I'm 20 minutes out." "Reyes, those 2 vehicles." "I know what they are." His voice was flat and sure. "I'll be there in 20. The call ended. Maya put the phone down and looked at Voss. "Cross is contained but safe. He needs someone at the North Gate." She stood. "I need to not be in this room." Voss stood too. "Reynolds, you are legally in investigative hold. If you walk out of here without authorization, it adds to the—" "I know what it adds to." Maya looked at her directly. "But Cross has been sitting in a parking lot for 50 minutes with 2 of Steele's vehicles behind him and the only physical copy of evidence that connects 7 deaths to one man's voice. And the digital copy is on a server that may not be secure for as long as we think it is if Steele's committee access goes higher than JAG." She held Voss's gaze. "Tell me the legal mechanism for releasing me from hold pending the evidence review." Voss looked at her. "There is one," Hollis said quietly from near the door. Both women looked at him. He had the expression of someone who'd been doing legal arithmetic while the conversation was happening and had arrived at an answer he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Material witness provision. If the subject of the hold is also a material witness to evidence that is actively at risk of destruction or interference, the holding authority can authorize temporary supervised release for the purpose of evidence preservation." He paused. "It requires the holding officer's signature." Caldwell, Maya said. Caldwell is the holding authority, yes. Hollis looked at his folder, then at Maya, then at the folder again. However, if the holding officer has a documented conflict of interest with the evidence in question, specifically if the evidence under risk implicates the holding officer in the conduct being investigated, then the authority transfers, Voss said. She was already on her phone. To the next available senior officer without conflict. Hollis met Maya's eyes, which in this case, given Caldwell's position and the command structure at Redstone, would be Voss was already talking into the phone. Quickly. Precisely. The name Maya heard was General Hales, and the words that followed were the words of someone who understood that the window was small and the cost of missing it was permanent. Maya stood in the middle of the room with its buzzing light and its metal table and its bolted-down chairs and its camera that had apparently stopped recording at some point in the past few hours, and she held herself still. Outside the door, she heard the MP shift his weight again. She heard Voss's voice, measured, urgent, the language of procedure being used as a lever against itself. She heard faintly the wind against the building's exterior, the flat, cold wind of a November night at a naval base, the same wind that had cut across the runway that morning when she'd walked toward Caldwell with 17 days of field and 4 dead soldiers and 14 alive ones behind her, stripped of her weapon and her badge and her command, wearing boots held together with electrical tape. She'd walked toward him then. She was going to walk out of here now. Voss lowered the phone. Hale signed it, she said. Supervised release, evidence preservation provision. Active immediately. She was already moving toward the door. We have a car. Maya picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She'd been holding it since they'd taken her field vest, and put it on. The shoulder screamed. She ignored it. Hollis opened the door. The MP outside looked at them, looked at the document Hollis held out, looked at Maya. Ma'am, he said, and stepped aside. The corridor was fluorescent and institutional, and it smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and Maya walked through it without looking back at the room, her boots on the floor making the specific sound of someone who had somewhere to be. Behind her, the door to the interrogation room swung slowly shut on its hinge. The buzzing light inside continued its uneven pulse in the empty room, casting its pale wash across the metal table and the 2 chairs and the paper cup she'd left beside the recorder. In the cup, a ring of dried water where the last of the liquid had evaporated over the course of an afternoon. Outside, the night was cold and clear. No weather restriction in effect. The North Gate was 4 minutes away by car, and the car Voss had arranged was a base vehicle driven by a sergeant who didn't ask questions, which was the right instinct given that the 3 people he was transporting included a JAG major, a JAG captain, and a commander who was technically on supervised release from an investigative hold and looked like she'd been in a war, which was because she had been. Maya sat in the back and watched the base slide past the window. The low buildings, the amber security lights, the wide, flat geometry of a military installation at night, everything organized and purposeful and illuminated just enough to move through without incident. She'd spent enough time on bases like this to have stopped seeing them years ago. Tonight she was seeing this one clearly, which was probably what happened when you'd been in a small room for 14 hours, and the world outside suddenly had dimension again. Her shoulder was getting worse. She could feel the specific heat of it through the field jacket, the infected tissue radiating at a frequency that was hard to ignore. She ignored it. Cross knows we're coming? She asked. Reyes told him, Voss said from the passenger seat. He's still at the North Gate. Both vehicles are still behind him. Steele's people. Presumably. They can't touch him at the gate. They can follow him when he leaves. He's not going to leave, Maya said. Not until we get there. Oh. Cross was exactly where Reyes had said, parked 20 feet from the gate checkpoint in a gray civilian sedan, engine running, interior dark. The 2 vehicles that had followed him from the facility were parked further back in a visitor lot, their engines also running, and Maya clocked them through the window with the automatic inventory of someone whose job for the past decade had required knowing where the threat was before the threat moved. The sergeant pulled in behind Cross. Maya was out of the car before it fully stopped, which she registered distantly as something Voss would probably have a professional opinion about and she would address later. She went to the driver's side of Cross's car. He rolled down the window. He looked like he'd been sitting in one position for too long, which he had, The stillness of someone who'd made a decision to not move until conditions changed and had been executing that decision with the rigid patience of a man who understood that moving wrong was worse than not moving at all. "Reynolds," he said, and then looked at the car she'd arrived in, at Voss and Hollis getting out. "You're out. Supervised release, evidence preservation provision." She looked at the visitor lot. "How long have they been on you?" "Since the parking structure." His jaw was tight. "I came out the secondary exit, and they were already there. 2 of them. They know what I have." "You're sure they don't have their own copy?" "The purge request wasn't granted," he said. "If it had been granted, they wouldn't need what I'm carrying. They need what I'm carrying because the archive is still intact, and they can't destroy it without destroying the evidence that a purge order was filed, which creates its own problem." He paused. "They're not going to take it here." "No, but they'll take it somewhere else if we give them a chance." She looked at him. "The drive goes to Hale's office, tonight." Cross looked past her at Voss. "She has the authorization," Voss said, stepping up. "General Hale's office issued a formal evidence hold 20 minutes ago. The drive becomes protected material the moment it enters his custody chain." Cross reached into his jacket and produced a small matte case, the twin of the one Voss had put on the table in the interrogation room. He held it for a moment before he handed it over, and in that moment Maya could see the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the other kind. "There's one more file on the drive," he said. "I flagged it in the custody document, but I didn't play it for anyone yet." He looked at Maya directly. "It's from Fox Run, 14 months ago." He paused. "The last transmission from the field element before contact was lost." The air between them went very still. "Bennett?" she said. "His team leader, a lieutenant named Carver." Cross held her gaze. He knew he was going to die. You can hear it in how he talks. He's not panicking. He's documenting. He's putting it on record what happened, who gave the orders, what the conditions were. A pause. He says Caldwell's name specifically, with the denial on record in the background. Maya didn't say anything. "He was 26, Cross said." She took the drive. "But they moved in 2 cars, Cross following the base vehicle, Reyes appearing from somewhere near the gate in a 3rd vehicle that positioned itself behind the 2 parked SUVs in a way that was not accidental. By the time both Steele's vehicles pulled out of the lot to follow, the configuration had shifted enough that pulling Cross over would have required going through Reyes first, and Reyes drove like a man who'd made that calculation in advance and was fine with the implications. Nobody got pulled over. The drive to the transit point, a secure JAG facility 6 miles from base, took 11 minutes. Maya spent them in the back seat looking at the matte case in her hands and thinking about a lieutenant named Carver, who'd been 26 years old and had spent his last transmissions building a case instead of asking for help he knew wasn't coming. She thought about what that took. She'd spent 17 days asking. Carver had apparently stopped asking and started documenting, and she didn't know whether that represented a different kind of courage than asking or the same kind expressed differently or whether it mattered. The result was the same. A man was dead, and the voice that had killed him was on a recording, and the recording existed. It had to count for something. It had to count for everything. The JAG facility had the institutional personality of all secure facilities. Controlled access, no windows in the working rooms, the permanent fluorescent quality of a place that didn't acknowledge the difference between day and night. They were met inside by a major named Tran who worked in Hale's office and had driven out personally at 1900 hours on a Tuesday because Voss had apparently communicated the situation with sufficient clarity that personal presence seemed warranted. Tran was precise, compact, and moved with the efficiency of someone who processed a lot of high-stakes paperwork and had learned to do it without being impressed by the stakes. She took the drive from Maya, logged it into a chain of custody manifest with Voss and Hollis countersigning, and placed it in a secured evidence container that she then sealed with a numbered tamper evidence strip. "General Hale will receive the full brief at 0700 tomorrow," she said. "The purge request," Voss said, "Steele's second filing, is under formal hold pending the evidence review." Tran looked at her clipboard. "The hold was issued under General Hale's subcommittee authority at 1812. It's on record." She looked at Maya. "Commander Reynolds." "Major." "The investigative hold on you remains technically in effect," Tran said. "The supervised release provision covers your presence here tonight." However, she paused. Given the material now in evidence custody, and given that the primary authority for your hold, Colonel Caldwell, is himself the subject of the evidence under review, there is a strong argument for transitioning you from hold to cooperation status by morning. What does cooperation status mean practically? It means you're a witness, not a defendant. Tran said it without particular drama. It means the charges filed under Caldwell's preliminary report become subject to review in light of the evidence, which is standard procedure when new material contradicts the basis of the original filing. Maya absorbed this. And Caldwell? Tran looked at her clipboard again, then at Voss, the specific look of someone choosing to let another person answer. When the evidence review convenes, Voss said, Caldwell's command authority will be suspended pending investigation. Standard protocol when the subject of inquiry holds command rank. She paused. Steele's involvement is a separate matter. That goes to the Oversight Committee's internal review process. Which Steele chairs? Which Steele chairs in part, Voss said carefully. General Hale chairs the Ethics Subcommittee, which has oversight authority over the main committee when there's a conflict of interest question. Another pause. If Steele filed a national security classification request to suppress evidence in an investigation that implicates a military officer he has a documented relationship with, that is a conflict of interest question. The geometry of institutional accountability was not clean and not fast and not satisfying in the way that Maya understood satisfaction. But it was real, and it was moving, and the evidence was in the box with the tamper evidence seal, and that was the thing that mattered tonight. She looked at the sealed container on Tran's desk. Somewhere on that drive, Lieutenant Carver was still talking. They put her in a room that was considerably less hostile than the interrogation room. There was a couch, a functional window, coffee that was bad in the ordinary way of institutional coffee rather than as a specific deprivation. Hollis brought it to her without being asked, and she drank half of it without tasting it. And he sat down across from her with the expression of a man who had been in motion for 12 straight hours and was now processing the fact that stopping meant the day arrived all at once. "You should sleep," he said. "Probably." She didn't move toward the couch. "Your shoulder needs attention." "I know." She looked at the window. Outside was a parking lot and a chain-link fence, and beyond the fence a highway, the ordinary infrastructure of a world going about its business at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Millstone operation, 2 deaths. Do you know who they were?" "No." "I'll find out." He said it quietly, without drama, the way someone says something they've already decided on. "Before the evidence review, I want their names in the record." She looked at him. He was younger than she'd initially assessed, late 20s, maybe 30, with the slightly formal bearing of someone who'd taken this work seriously from the beginning rather than settling into its seriousness over time. He'd been handed this case at 0700 this morning, told to manage a routine investigative hold, and had spent the ensuing 14 hours discovering that the routine investigation was a constructed frame around 7 deaths and an oversight committee official willing to invoke national security authority to prevent the truth from getting out. He looked tired. He also looked like someone who was going to do the work. "Hollis," she said. He looked up. "Why did you tell me about the soldiers in the medical bay?" "This morning. You didn't have to." He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the pause of someone who doesn't give automatic answers to real questions. "Because it was true," he said, "and it seemed like something you should know." He paused again. "And because I read the preliminary report before I came in to see you, and something about the timeline was off, and—" He stopped, started again. "I've read a lot of incident reports, the good ones and the bad ones. The ones that are trying to find out what happened and the ones that are trying to explain something that's already been decided." He met her eyes. That one was the second kind. Maya held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, flat and direct, without the performance of gratitude. He nodded once and let it land. The medical team came at 2100. A doctor from the JAG facility's on-call roster, a tired woman named Dr. Patel, who examined Maya's shoulder with the focused efficiency of someone who had clearly been called away from something she'd rather be doing and was professional enough not to let that affect the work. "This is infected," Patel said, which was not news. "You should have had antibiotics 24 hours ago." I had them in the field. You needed them here too. She was cleaning the wound, which felt exactly as bad as Maya had been expecting. The field dressing held reasonably well. Whoever did it, Torres, Corporal Torres. He probably kept this from getting significantly worse. She paused. The ribs? 2, maybe 3. I'll need imaging to confirm. Patel reached for something in her kit. You are aware that you have been walking around with cracked ribs and an infected shoulder wound for approximately 17 hours since returning to base? I'm aware. I'm going to need you to explain the medical triage situation to me. There was a hold. I was in a room. Patel's hand stilled for a moment, then continued. She didn't say anything, but something in the set of her jaw changed. Not anger, exactly. The controlled expression of a person filing something away. I'm going to give you a proper antibiotic course and real pain management, she said. Not field grade. You're going to sleep after this. I need to be functional at EO 700. You can be functional at EO 700 and sleep between now and then. Those are not mutually exclusive. She looked at Maya directly. Commander, you've been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for somewhere between 17 days and 17 hours, and your body is starting to collect the debt. Let me do my job. Maya let her. She did sleep eventually, on the couch, with her jacket over her, the specific deep sleep of a body that had been owed a debt for a long time and was collecting it without asking permission. She woke at 0520, stiff and sore in the comprehensive way of someone whose injuries had been told to wait and were done waiting, the pain medication having done what it could and reaching its end. The room was gray with early light. She sat on the edge of the couch and gave herself 60 seconds, which was the amount of time she'd given herself every morning for 17 days. 60 seconds for the accounting, for the weight of it, and then you picked it up and you moved. 4 names: Peterson, Alvarez, Cho, Marsh. She said them in her head in the specific private way that was not ritual and not observance, but just memory. The record. The people who hadn't made it back and whose absence was now permanently threaded into the texture of every day she had. And then Bennett, Carver. The 2 from Millstone whose names she didn't have yet but would. 60 seconds. She stood up. The 0700 brief was held in a conference room at the JAG facility with General Richard Hale present via secure video link, which Maya had expected, and with 2 additional people she hadn't expected, a civilian attorney from the Inspector General's office and a brigadier general named Walsh, who apparently served on Hale's subcommittee and had driven 2 hours in the night to be present in person, which told her something about how Hale's office had understood the situation. Hale was in his late 60s, gray-haired, with the face of someone who had seen enough institutional maneuvering to be unimpressed by it, and enough genuine failure of duty to be moved by it, and the combination had produced an expression that was steady without being cold. He looked at Maya when the connection established and nodded once, the specific nod of a person who has been briefed and is now looking at the source material. Tron ran the presentation. She was the kind of professional who had prepared this kind of thing before and showed it. Concise, sequenced, the material organized to answer the questions a decision-maker would have in the order they'd have them. The recordings first. The Clearwater transmissions. The denial sequence, Caldwell's authorization code and voice on each one. The room during the recordings was very quiet. Then the Fox Run material. Then the reference to Millstone. Hale watched and listened and didn't interrupt. Walsh, next to Tron at the front of the room, made notes on a legal pad with a pen that scratched audibly in the silence. At the end, Hale was quiet for a moment. Then, Commander Reynolds. Sir? I want to hear from you directly, not from the file. He looked at her through the screen. Day 6. The first denial. Walk me through what happened after you received it. She walked him through it. Not the formal version. She'd given the formal version to Voss and it was in the record. She gave him the operational version, what the conditions were, what her unit's status was, what the denial meant in terms of survival math, how she'd responded, what she'd tried next. She was specific about the meteorological data. She had memorized those numbers 17 days ago because she'd known even then that they might matter, and specific about the medical status of her critical casualty and the window they'd had before the window closed. Hale listened without expression. Day 11, he said. The collapsed corridor. She told him. The 2 men she'd left in when the ceiling came down. The 40 minutes. Coming back twice, and the math not working. At what point did you determine the second attempt had to be aborted? He asked. When structural integrity failed on the secondary access point. Her voice was even. I had 11 other soldiers on the perimeter. If I stayed in the corridor, I was trading 11 for 2, and the 2 were already... She stopped. Restarted. The 2 were already beyond the window. By the time I made the call, the window had been closed for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. The second attempt confirmed it. You documented that assessment at the time? In the mission log. Yes, sir. Haley looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression was careful and direct at the same time. The look of someone doing the work of seeing a situation without the lens of what they'd expected to see. The preliminary report characterizes Day 11 as reckless endangerment, he said. Yes, sir. Based on what you've described, the more accurate characterization would be controlled decision-making under extreme time constraint with incomplete information. She held his gaze, which is what field command is. The silence held. Yes, Hale said. It is. He looked at Walsh. Something passed between them. Not words. The shorter communication of people who'd worked together long enough to have a common language in silence. Commander Reynolds, Hale said. The investigative hold against you is being formally suspended pending the conclusion of the evidence review. He paused. The charges filed in the preliminary report are under direct review in light of the archive material. You are transitioning to cooperation status effective immediately. Maya held herself still. The charges will be dropped, she said. Not a question. She needed to hear him say it. The preliminary report doesn't survive the recording, Hale said. It was the most direct thing he'd said, and he said it simply, without comfort or performance. The charges go with it. Yes. She exhaled, just once, short. The specific exhale of someone who has been holding something at a distance for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. Caldwell, she said, his command authority was suspended at 0600 this morning pending formal investigation. Hale's voice stayed level. The scope of the investigation now includes Fox, Run, and Millstone. The IG's office is involved. He paused. The process from here is not fast. I know. But it moves. Yes, sir. She paused. Steele. Hale looked at her. His classification filing, she said, the second purge request, is under review by the Ethics Subcommittee. Hale's expression gave her nothing extra. That process also moves. She understood what that meant. Not today, not fast. But the fact of the filing was on record. Hollis had logged Steele's call to his office. The second purge request had Steele's committee designation attached. The timeline of both filings was documented. It was not enough yet, but it existed, and things that exist are harder to make disappear than things that only live in memory. There is one more thing, Voss said from beside Maya. Hale looked at her. The soldiers from Commander Reynolds' unit who were pressured to sign statements in the medical bay. Voss had a folder in her hands. Several of them were told, in explicit terms, that their service records and career prospects were contingent on cooperation with the preliminary inquiry. She opened the folder. That constitutes improper command influence over potential witnesses, which is a separate charge category. She set the folder on the table in front of Walsh. I'd like it included in the scope of the investigation. Walsh looked at the folder, picked it up. Noted, he said. Hale looked at Maya one more time. Is there anything else at this point that the review needs to know? She thought about it, not performatively, actually thought about it, running through the sequence of the past 36 hours, the things that were in the record and the things that were in her head, and whether there was a gap between them that needed to be closed. The Millstone casualties, she said. I want their names in the record before the review convenes, not as a footnote, in the primary document. Hale nodded. That'll be done. And their families notified that the investigation has been reopened. She paused. However long it's been, whatever they were told, they should know the investigation is happening. Something moved across Hale's face that was very briefly not the face of a general managing an institutional process. Then it was contained, and he was looking at her evenly again. That is appropriate, he said, and it will be done. They gave her a car and a driver back to base at EO 900. She sat in the back and watched the highway, the flat November light washing the landscape into something colorless and wide. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired into a kind of fundamental physical depletion, the kind that was going to require days to correct and would not be corrected today. Her shoulder had been properly treated. Her ribs were taped. She had real antibiotics and real pain management, and had eaten something that approximated breakfast from the JAG facility's break room. She thought about her soldiers. They were still on base, most of them still in the medical wing, she assumed, though some might have been transferred to appropriate facilities depending on the specifics of their treatment needs. She hadn't seen them since the runway. She'd heard about them through Hollis and Mitchell's brief appearance in the interrogation room, and she'd held them in the way she'd held everything during those 14 hours, at a certain careful distance, because letting them get close would have cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. She could let them get close now. The driver, a young corporal who'd been told nothing about the situation except where to go and where to stop, navigated the base entrance and followed her directions toward the medical wing without comment. When the car stopped in front of the building, she sat for a moment, her hand on the door handle. Inside that building were 14 people who had sat in a field with her for 17 days and learned something that people in those situations learn, which is that the ordinary language of rank and protocol and institutional relationship doesn't survive long when the walls are collapsing. What's underneath it is something else, something that doesn't have a good name and doesn't need one because the people who've experienced it know what it is, and the people who haven't can't be fully told. She got out of the car. The medical wing was the medical wing. Antiseptic smell, linoleum floors, the specific fluorescent quality of clinical spaces. A duty nurse at the front desk looked up and was in the process of preparing the standard visitor inquiry when she apparently recognized either Maya's face or her rank or the specific expression of someone who was not going to be stopped by paperwork. "Commander Reynolds," the nurse said, and then, without being asked, "Ward B." Most of them are still here. Ward B was a room that had clearly been arranged to accommodate more people than it usually held. Extra beds rolled in, chairs along the wall, a configuration that suggested someone had made a decision to keep the unit together rather than distributing them through the facility. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment. 12 of them were there. Delaney, his arm in a proper sling now. Ramos, sitting up in bed looking fundamentally hostile in the way Ramos always looked, which she'd learned meant he was fine. Okafor, asleep. 3 others she could name in her sleep from 17 days of counting shoulders. And Garrett. He was awake. He was sitting on the edge of his bed with his feet on the floor and his hands between his knees. And when she came through the door, he looked up and something moved across his face that was complicated and young and exhausted and real. She crossed the room without a speech, without preamble. She put her hand on his shoulder, the good one, not the one that had taken a bruise on day 13, and left it there. He didn't say anything, neither did she. Around them, the room was waking up to her presence, the small sounds of men registering that she was there, the shift of attention that didn't require words. Mitchell's voice from across the room. "Told you she'd be out by morning." "You said noon," Ramos said. "I said by noon. There's a distinction." The room had the quality of something that had been held very tight for a very long time and was starting, in small, cautious increments, to loosen. Maya took her hand off Garrett's shoulder. She looked at the room. At 12 faces, tired, damaged, carrying things that were going to take longer to heal than the physical injuries, and she felt the weight of the 4 who weren't in it, with a clarity that didn't diminish and wasn't supposed to. "Caldwell's been suspended," she said. Not raising her voice, she didn't need to. The room was already listening. "The investigation is open. The charges against me are being dropped." Quiet. "What you did," she said. "Not signing, not cooperating with a document that misrepresented what happened out there." She paused. "That mattered. It bought time. The archive needed time and you gave it." Delaney looked at the ceiling. Ramos looked at his hands. Garrett was looking at her with the same expression he'd worn on day 14 when she'd told him they were going home. That specific look that was past the point of reasonable trust into something harder to name. "The 4 we lost," she said. "Their record is going to reflect what actually happened. That's not finished yet, but it's moving," Mitchell said from across the room. "What about the others? Bennett's operation?" "Investigation is open," she said. "All 3 operations. The archive covers all of them." Silence. Remus said, "Who was Millstone?" "I don't have names yet." She held his gaze. "I will." He nodded once. She stayed in the room for another hour. Didn't give speeches and didn't manage the atmosphere. Just stayed, moving from bed to bed, listening when there was something to listen to and being present when there wasn't. Delaney told her about the MP who'd come in at 0200 with the statement forms and what he'd said to him, which she was fairly certain would have made Ramos's phrasing look diplomatic. Torres showed her his own shoulder, which had been injured on day 15, and which he'd been treating himself because there was no one else to treat it, and which had been treated properly here, and was going to need 3 weeks of rest that he was never going to take. Garrett said, at some point when most of the others were in other conversations, "I knew you'd figure it out." "I had help," she said. "Yeah, but you figured out who to ask." He looked at his hands. "That's the part nobody taught you. You just did it." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure he needed one. Outside the ward's high windows, the November light was shifting, warming slightly, the flat gray of early morning moving towards something with a little more texture. Not warmth, exactly. Just the ordinary change of daylight doing what daylight did, regardless of what was happening underneath it. The investigation was open. It would take time. Longer than she wanted, more complicated than it should be, with procedural steps and institutional friction and the specific resistance of systems that don't like to find fault with themselves. Steele would have lawyers. The Oversight Committee review would be slow. There would be hearings and depositions and moments where the machinery seemed to be grinding rather than moving. But the archive existed. The recordings existed. 3 operations, the same voice, the same lie. It was all on record, time-stamped and authority-coded, and sitting in an evidence container with a tamper-evidence seal in a JAG facility 6 miles away. And Carver was still talking. That was the part that stayed with her. A lieutenant she'd never met, 26 years old, spending his last transmissions building a case, not asking for rescue, documenting. She was going to listen to that recording properly. Not today. Today her body needed the rest it had been owed for 3 weeks, and her soldiers needed her present, and the investigation needed the cooperation statement she was scheduled to give at 1400. But she was going to listen, and she was going to make sure Carver's family knew what their son had done with his last minutes. Not just that he'd died, but how he'd died, and what the dying had produced, and that his voice was the reason 7 deaths were now the subject of a formal investigation rather than a collection of closed files and footnotes. Mitchell caught her on the way out. He was standing by the ward door with his arm in its proper sling, looking better than he had in the parking lot at the north gate, which wasn't a high bar, but was still something. "Steele," he said. "He's going to get out of this." She looked at him. "Maybe not all the way out," Mitchell said. "But enough. People like that usually do." "Maybe," she said, "but not without the record showing what he tried to do." Mitchell looked at her with the specific look of someone who has been in enough situations to know the difference between optimism and accuracy and is trying to determine which one he's hearing. "Is that enough?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Not by itself," she said, "but it's where you start." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped aside from the door. She walked out into the corridor, and then out of the building, and then into the cold November air of a morning that was 2 days past the worst of it, and still a long way from the end. The cooperation statement took 3 hours. She gave it in a room at the JAG facility with Voss beside her and a recorder on the table and 2 investigators from the IG's office asking questions with the methodical patience of people who understood that the quality of the record they were building now would determine what was possible 6 months from now. Maya answered everything. She was specific where specificity mattered and honest about the gaps where her memory had edges. Day 9 was compressed in ways she couldn't fully account for. The stress hormone effect on encoding that she knew about theoretically and had experienced practically. She said so. The investigators noted it and moved on. When it was done, she signed the statement, and the lead investigator, a quiet man named Ferris who'd said perhaps 40 words in 3 hours, looked at her across the table with the specific expression of someone who has been doing this work long enough to know when a case is solid and when it isn't. "Commander," he said, "thank you for your time." She nodded and stood, and her ribs reminded her about themselves. The charges against her were formally withdrawn at 1700 that afternoon. Voss brought the document to her in a corridor outside the conference room, a single page with official stamps and signatures, and Maya read it standing up and handed it back. "Keep it," Voss said. "You'll want it." Maya looked at the page. She took it. She listened to Carver's recording that evening. Voss had arranged access, a private room, a laptop, the audio file isolated from the rest of the archive material. There was no reason Maya needed to hear it before the investigation used it. It wasn't required for the case, wasn't necessary for the cooperation statement, wasn't anything she'd been asked to do. She needed to hear it anyway. She sat alone with the laptop and pressed play. Carver's voice was younger than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything. She hadn't known him. He had a slight accent she couldn't place exactly, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region, and he spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had made a deliberate decision about what to do with the time he had left and was executing it. He named the operation, the date, his rank and assignment. He named the members of his team by name and rank, each one. He described the situation, the position, the hostile contact, the casualties, the status of the two people still alive when he made the recording. He described the extraction requests and the denials, and when he described Caldwell's voice coming back through the radio saying, "weather restriction in effect," his own voice stayed steady in a way that cost him something she could hear in the quality of the silence that followed the words. Then he said, "I want the record to show that there is no weather restriction. The sky is clear. I can see stars." A pause. "I want the record to show that Colonel Caldwell denied this extraction with full knowledge of our status and the operational conditions." Another pause, shorter. "I want the record to show that my team did everything right." The recording ended. Maya sat in the room for a while after it ended. She wasn't going to cry, and she didn't, but she sat with it the way you sit with weight. Not resisting, not performing composure, just absorbing. The specific heaviness of a young man's voice laying out the facts with the calm of someone who had accepted what was coming and decided that what mattered was leaving something behind that could not be argued with. He'd been 26. He'd been afraid. She could hear that underneath the steadiness, the same way she could hear what was underneath her own voice in the Clearwater recordings. And he'd been afraid, and he'd kept talking, and he'd gotten it all on record. She pressed play again. She listened to the whole thing a second time. Then she closed the laptop, stood up slowly, and went to find Hollis, who was in a shared office down the corridor, working on something at a desk that wasn't his. The temporary geography of a person borrowed from their normal context by a case that had expanded beyond its original shape. He looked up when she came in. "The Millstone names," she said. He turned a page in the folder in front of him. "Sergeant Derek Holt and Specialist Amara Osei." He looked at her. Holt was 29. Osei was 24. The official record on Millstone lists cause of death as hostile fire during extraction delay due to adverse weather conditions. The same language, the same excuse, almost verbatim. Families? Holt's parents are in Ohio. Osei's family is in Georgia, her mother and 2 brothers. He closed the folder. "I have addresses." Maya looked at him. "I want to be there when they're notified," she said. Hollis was quiet for a moment. "That's not standard procedure for—" "I know it isn't." She held his gaze. "I want to be there anyway. They should hear it from someone who is in the field, not just from a uniform with paperwork." He looked at her with the expression he used when he was making a real decision rather than a procedural one. "I'll make the arrangements," he said. The investigation moved away. Investigations move, not the way movies imagine them, all momentum and revelation, but the way they actually work, which involves a lot of documents and a lot of waiting and a lot of the same information presented in slightly different formats to slightly different rooms of people who each require their own account of it. Maya gave 4 more statements over the following 3 weeks. She answered questions from the IG's office and from the ethics subcommittee and from a separate inquiry panel that Hale's office convened specifically to examine the Millstone and Fox Run operations. She went to Ohio first. Holt's parents lived in a house on a street in Columbus that looked like 1,000 other streets. Modest, maintained, a neighborhood where people stayed for decades. His father came to the door, a man in his 60s with his son's jaw and the eyes of someone who had received the first notification 2 years ago and had never quite finished receiving it. His mother was in the kitchen. She didn't come to the door immediately. and when she did, she was drying her hands on a dish towel, and she stopped when she saw Maya's uniform. "Mrs. Holt," Maya said, "I'm Commander Maya Reynolds. I'm here because the investigation into your son's death has been reopened." The dish towel went still. Maya told them what she could tell them. Not everything, the classified portions would remain classified, but the essential fact. Derek Holt had not died because conditions prevented his rescue. He had died because a commanding officer issued a false denial. That denial was on record. The investigation was active. The man responsible was facing formal charges. She told them that their son had done everything right. She didn't try to make it easier than it was. There was no version of this conversation that was easy, and the attempt to make it easy would have been its own kind of disrespect. Holt's mother sat on the couch in the living room and held the dish towel in both hands and wept in the specific quiet way of someone who has been grieving for 2 years and has just discovered that grief had a different shape than she thought. Not smaller, but different, because now there was somewhere to put the anger that had been sitting underneath it with nowhere to go. His father didn't cry. He sat beside his wife with his hand on her back and looked at Maya with the steady, absorbing look of a man taking in information that changed something fundamental. He trusted them, the father said. Not accusatory, just the plain statement of a fact. "Yes," Maya said. "He did. And they—" He stopped. "Yes," she said again. The silence held. Before she left, Holt's father walked her to the door and stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame. He looked like he was trying to find language for something that didn't fit language cleanly. "Are they going to actually do something about it?" he said. "Or is this going to be another piece of paper?" She looked at him. "I can't promise the outcome," she said, "but the evidence is solid and the people reviewing it are doing their jobs." She paused. "I'll be watching it every step of the way. If it stalls, I'll find someone who can unstall it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who had learned to take what he was given and assess it on its own terms rather than against hope. "Thank you for coming," he said. She drove to Georgia the next morning. Osie's mother was a different kind of grief entirely, harder on the surface and softer underneath, the armor of someone who had processed the first notification through a combination of fury and action, who had written letters and made calls and been told in patient institutional language that the findings were final and the file was closed, and who had eventually stopped because the wall didn't move regardless of how hard you hit it. She was a woman in her 50s named Grace, and when Maya told her the investigation was open, she didn't cry. She looked at Maya across a kitchen table with dark eyes that were doing the specific calculation of someone deciding whether to believe something. "Why now?" she said. Maya told her about the archive, about the recordings, about the fact that the denials were on record and the stated reason was demonstrably false, and that the same pattern had appeared in 3 operations under the same commanding officer. Grace listened. 3 operations, she said. "Yes. And nobody knew until now. Nobody who could do something about it until now." Maya held her gaze. "Your daughter was the second. The first operation was buried. Your daughter's operation was buried. The third one, mine. I came back alive. 4 of my people didn't, but 14 did, and we came back with the ability to push back." Grace was quiet for a long time. One of her sons, older, maybe 30, who had been standing in the doorway since Maya arrived and hadn't said a word, shifted his weight against the frame. "Amara would have been a sergeant by now," Grace said. Finally. Not to Maya specifically, just said it, the way people sometimes say things out loud that they've been carrying in their heads for too long. "She was very good," Maya said. She hadn't known Osea. She said so clearly, she didn't want to claim something she didn't have, but I've read her service record and her unit evaluations, and she was the kind of soldier other soldiers counted on. She paused. "That's in the record. It's not going to change." Grace looked at her. "You came here yourself," she said. "Yes." "You didn't have to." "No," Maya said. "I didn't." Grace looked down at the table, then at Maya again, with the expression of a woman arriving at a decision. "Tell me what you need from me," she said, "for the investigation." Caldwell's formal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after his suspension. The charges included falsifying operational orders, conduct unbecoming an officer, and after the Millstone and Fox Run files were formally incorporated into the investigation, contributing to the deaths of military personnel through deceptive command decisions. 7 counts in total. The legal architecture of it was something Voss and the IG's attorneys had built carefully, each count supported by the archive material, each denial time-stamped and authority-coded, and as close to unassailable as evidence got. He did not take it quietly. His attorneys filed 3 separate motions to suppress the archive material on national security grounds, each one citing Steele's original classification request as precedent. Each one was denied by the review panel, which had the benefit of Hale's subcommittee authorization, and the IG's formal finding that the classification request had been improper, filed to suppress evidence rather than to protect genuine operational security, a distinction that mattered legally and that the record made clear. Steele was a separate process, slower. The Oversight Committee's internal review moved with the particular friction of an institution examining itself, which meant it moved reluctantly and required external pressure to keep moving. Hale applied that pressure consistently, in the specific methodical way of someone who understood that institutions respond to sustained force more reliably than to dramatic confrontation. By the end of the 2nd month, Steele had been removed from his committee chair pending the outcome of the internal review. By the end of the 3rd month, the review had expanded to include 2 other officials whose authorization codes appeared in documents connected to Caldwell's operations. The thread, once pulled, did not stop. Maya wasn't in the room for most of it. She gave testimony when testimony was required and submitted documents when documents were required, and then went back to the work of the rest of her life, which had not stopped existing because the investigation was ongoing. She went back to her unit. Not the same unit. The 14 survivors had been reassigned through the standard post-operation process, each to the next phase of their service, some recovering, some back in the field, some beginning the paperwork of separating from the military, with the specific complicated ambivalence of people who were ready to leave and would never fully leave. She checked on each of them in the ways available to her: a call, an email, a visit when geography allowed. Garrett had been transferred to a forward unit after his medical clearance. He sent her a 2-line message when his clearance came through. "Doc says I'm good. Told him took him long enough." She sent back, "Don't do anything stupid." He sent, "Define stupid." She didn't answer that one. Torres was on medical leave for his shoulder, which he was using to visit his family in San Antonio, which she knew because he sent her a photograph of his nephew wearing his patrol cap with no accompanying text. She sent back a thumbs up. Ramos, she heard through Mitchell, had filed a formal statement with the IG's office specifically detailing the 0200 visit from Caldwell's aide and the exact language used when the statements were presented. He had apparently also provided a highly specific account of his response to that language, which he had insisted on including in full, and which the investigator had eventually agreed to note in the record with a parenthetical disclaimer. Mitchell himself had made a decision she found out about through Hollis. He had extended his service for another 2 years and had submitted a transfer request to a training command, where he was going to teach junior soldiers field medicine and communication protocols. When she called him about it, he said, "Someone has to make sure the next group knows how to use a SCARLET channel correctly," and she understood that he meant something more by it than radio procedure. Thus, Caldwell's hearing ran for 4 days. Maya was there for all of it. Not because she was required to be, she testified on the 2nd day, and could have left after, but because she had decided that bearing witness was its own form of accountability, and she was going to do it. The recordings were played in full on the 1st day. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with order. It was the quiet of people hearing something that removed ambiguity, the specific silence that falls when a voice on a tape says something that cannot be interpreted away. Caldwell's voice, 3 operations, 3 sets of denials, the same stated reason each time, his authorization code on each one, his voice telling Maya's unit to hold position while a clear sky opened over them. Caldwell sat at the defense table with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years building an identity around authority and was watching that identity dissolve in real time without quite believing it was happening to him. She watched him during the playback. He didn't look at her. His attorney made the arguments attorneys make: procedural challenges, chain of custody questions, interpretation disputes that tried to reframe the denials as legitimate operational judgments made under imperfect information. The arguments were technically competent, and they didn't survive contact with the recordings, with Cross's chain of custody documentation, with the meteorological data Maya had logged in real time, with the accumulated weight of 3 operations that showed the same pattern in the same handwriting. On the 4th day, the panel delivered its findings, guilty on 5 of 7 counts, the 2 counts that didn't result in findings, the broadest of the charges, the ones that required establishing intent beyond a reasonable doubt, in circumstances where intent was always the hardest thing to prove, were not exonerations. They were the places where the evidence was sufficient to establish what happened, but not fully sufficient to establish the precise mechanism of why. And the panel said so explicitly in its findings, which meant the record was clear about what the not guilty findings did and didn't mean. 5 counts. Conduct unbecoming, falsifying operational orders. 3 counts of contributing to preventable deaths through deceptive command decisions. 1 for Clearwater, 1 for Fox Run, 1 for Millstone. The sentencing followed 2 weeks later. Dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all rank, benefits, and pension. 8 years in a military correctional facility with the panel's written recommendation against early release. Maya was not present for the sentencing. She was in Columbus, Ohio, sitting across from Holt's parents when Hollis called to tell her the outcome. She stepped outside to take the call, stood on the front porch in the cold with her phone against her ear, and listened to the numbers. When Hollis finished, she said, "Thank you," and ended the call and stood there for a moment in the November air, almost exactly 1 year since she'd stepped off a helicopter at Redstone in boots held together with electrical tape. Then she went back inside and told Holt's parents. The father sat with it. The mother pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the window and said quietly, "Good." Not triumphant, not relieved, just the word, simple and contained, the sound of someone arriving at the end of a very long thing. 6 months after Clearwater, the Armed Forces Oversight Subcommittee, under Hale's leadership, following the removal of 2 members, including Steele, proposed and passed a procedural reform requiring independent review of all denied emergency extraction requests. The review could not be conducted by any officer within the same command chain as the officer issuing the denial. It had to be completed within 6 hours. The findings had to be filed in the primary archive with full documentation. It was called the Clearwater Protocol in the official record. Voss told her about it over the phone, and Maya was quiet for a moment. "They named it," she said. "It'll be in every operational manual," Voss said. "Every base, every command structure." Maya sat with that. "It should have Bennett's name," she said, "and Carver's, and Holt, and Ossie." "There's an amendment being proposed," Voss said. "A memorial clause in the preamble, all 7. 7 names in the preamble of a procedure that would change how the military handled extraction denials for every operation going forward. Not justice, she understood the difference between justice and procedure, but something real. Something that would exist after all of them were gone, that would sit at the front of a document and say, "These people, this happened, we are doing this so it does not happen again." She said, "Good," the same way Holt's mother had said it, without triumph. Just the word. She flew out on a deployment rotation 8 months after Clearwater. Different unit, different command structure. The ordinary continuation of a military career that had been interrupted and was now, paperwork complete and record cleared and charges formally expunged, continuing. At the airfield before boarding, she did the things she did before every deployment. The accounting, the reckoning, the list she carried with her the way other people carried photographs. Peterson, Alvarez, Cho, Marsh, Bennett, Carver, Holt, Osei. 8 names. Not a ritual, just memory. The refusal to let the dead become abstract. The helicopter rotors were already turning when she crossed the tarmac, and the crew chief at the door counted the boarding personnel with the automatic efficiency of someone whose job it was to know exactly how many people were in his aircraft. She stopped on the step, looked back at the airfield. The flat expanse of it, the amber lights, the cold, clear air that smelled like aviation fuel and wet concrete. She thought about Garrett's message, "Doc says I'm good," about Torres's photograph, about Mitchell teaching radio protocol to people who hadn't been in the field yet and didn't know what the radio could mean. She thought about Grace Osei sitting across a kitchen table saying, Tell me what you need from me, with her eyes steady and her hands flat on the surface. She thought about a young man named Carver, who had spent his last minutes making sure the record was clean. The crew chief's voice, "Commander, we're ready." She turned, counted heads through the open door. The automatic count. The same one she'd done every morning for 17 days in a field with no air support and no extraction and no guarantee of anything, except that the people behind her were hers to bring home. She got in. The door closed. The helicopter lifted. Months later, when people asked her how she'd held it together during the investigation, the interrogation room, the charges, Steele's visit, the hours of not knowing whether the archive would survive long enough to matter, she gave them the honest answer, which was that she hadn't held it together. There were moments when the thing inside her chest was very close to the surface, when the weight of 4 dead soldiers and 17 days, and a buzzing fluorescent light, and a man who thought his rank made him immune to his own voice on a tape, was nearly more than the container. She hadn't held it together. She'd kept going anyway. That was the distinction that mattered. Not whether you fell apart. Everyone fell apart, in the ways specific to them, in the moments when the cost of not falling apart became temporarily too high, but whether you kept going after. Mitchell had kept going with shrapnel in his shoulder. Garrett had kept going when his voice stopped working. Carver had kept going when he knew there was nothing left to keep going toward. Had kept going for the record, for the names, for the small, precise act of making sure the truth existed somewhere after he didn't. A uniform doesn't make you that. Rank doesn't make you that. What makes you that is the decision. Repeated, unspectacular, costly, in ways you don't always see until later. To be the person who doesn't leave, who doesn't sign the paper, who keeps the radio on and keeps talking into it even when the voice coming back is a lie. That's the only thing that ever mattered. That's what brought them home.